It was a chilly autumn evening in the small suburban town of Maplewood, a place where the tension in the air had become almost palpable. Recent incidents of racial profiling by the local police had stirred unease among its residents, particularly the African American community. While the town prided itself on its picturesque streets and quiet neighborhoods, the undercurrent of division was impossible to ignore. Amara Johnson, a 17-year-old African-American girl, walked briskly down the dimly lit street, her breath forming small clouds in the crisp night air. She had just finished a long shift at the local diner, where she worked part-time to save money for her baby's arrival. Clutching her backpack tightly, she kept her other hand protectively resting on her growing belly, her steps steady but hurried. Her thoughts were a whirlwind of worry. Rent was due in a week, her next doctor's appointment was looming, and she still needed to buy essentials for the baby. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on her young shoulders, but she pushed forward, her determination unshaken. The street was nearly deserted, with only the faint hum of streetlights and the occasional rustle of leaves breaking the silence. In the distance, the flashing red and blue lights of a police car caught her eye. Her heart skipped a beat as she noticed the vehicle parked across the street, its engine idling. Amara's grip on her backpack tightened instinctively. She'd heard too many stories, of neighbors, friends, and even strangers, caught in the web of suspicion simply because of the color of their skin. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. "Keep your head down, stay polite, and come home safe." She quickened her pace, trying to stay calm. As she passed the convenience store on the corner, she noticed the officer sitting in the car glance her way. For a moment, their eyes met through the windshield, and Amara felt a chill that wasn't from the cool night air. She looked away and kept walking, hoping she wouldn't hear the dreaded call. But then it came. "Hey, stop right there!" Her heart sank. The quiet night shattered as the officer's sharp voice cut through the air. Amara froze mid-step, her pulse pounding in her ears. She turned slowly, her breath hitching, and saw the officer stepping out of his car, his flashlight pointed directly at her. "Where are you headed this late at night?" Officer Trent's voice was firm, carrying an edge of suspicion. He was a stocky man with a gruff demeanor, the kind of officer who rarely smiled, especially on duty. His flashlight's beam landed squarely on Amara's face, making her squint. "I'm just heading home from work," Amara replied, her voice steady but laced with caution. She kept her hands visible, gripping the straps of her backpack tightly. "We got a call about someone loitering near the convenience store down the block. The description matches you. You been hanging around there?" Trent's eyes scanned her from head to toe, his expression unreadable. Amara's brow furrowed. "No, sir. I just walked past it on my way home. I didn't stop." Trent's lips pressed into a thin line. "Mind if I take a look inside your bag?" Her grip on the backpack tightened instinctively. "Why?" "I didn't do anything wrong." "Let's not make this harder than it has to be," Trent said, his tone taking on a harder edge. "Hand over the bag." Amara's chest tightened as a mix of fear and frustration welled up inside her. Slowly, she unzipped her bag and handed it to him. Trent rummaged through it, pulling out textbooks, her diner apron, and a wrapped sandwich. Finding nothing, he tossed the bag back to her. "What about your pockets? Empty them," he demanded. "There's nothing in them," Amara replied, her voice trembling slightly. "I've told you. I haven't done anything." By now, a few bystanders had gathered on the sidewalk, drawn by the raised voices. Some pulled out their phones and began recording the scene. A man's voice called out, "What's going on?" "She's just a kid." Ignoring the murmurs from the growing crowd, Trent stepped closer. "Turn around and put your hands on your head." Amara's eyes widened. "Why? I haven't done anything." "Do it now," Trent snapped, his hand moving to his belt. The sight of his hand hovering near his weapon made Amara's blood run cold. Trembling, she turned and placed her hands on her head. Trent grabbed her arms and cuffed her, the cold metal biting into her wrists. "You're under arrest for suspicion of theft," he announced flatly. "This is wrong," Amara protested, her voice breaking. "I didn't take anything." The bystanders' voices grew louder, their outrage evident. "Why are you arresting her? She didn't do anything," a woman shouted. Another man added, "This is racial profiling. We're recording this." Trent's jaw tightened, but he didn't look at the crowd. "I'm just doing my job," he muttered, leading Amara toward his patrol car. Tears streamed down her face as she pleaded with him. "Please, I'm pregnant. I didn't do anything wrong," she said, her voice cracking under the weight of humiliation and fear. But Trent remained silent, his grip firm as he guided her into the back seat of his car. The murmurs of the crowd and the glow of phone cameras followed them as the car pulled away, leaving behind a simmering tension in the air. Inside the car, Amara stared out of the window, her reflection blurred by tears. The humiliation burned deep, but beneath it was a growing ember of anger. This wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had ever been judged, accused, or silenced because of the color of their skin. Amara's mind wandered as she sat alone in the cold, dimly lit holding cell. The silence of the police station seemed to stretch endlessly, broken only by the occasional muffled conversation in the distance. Despite the fatigue pulling at her, she couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, the events of the night replayed in her mind, each moment more surreal than the last. To distract herself, her thoughts drifted back to where it all began. Amara had always been a fighter. Raised by a single mother who juggled multiple jobs to keep the lights on and food on the table, she'd learned early on what it meant to work hard. Her mother, a kind but no-nonsense woman, often told her, "We don't get to rest. We fight. For ourselves and for each other." It was a mantra that Amara carried with her through every challenge. In school, Amara had been a bright student, often praised for her dedication and resilience. Her teachers would comment on how she stayed after class to ask questions or finish assignments, even when she was visibly exhausted. "You've got potential, Amara," one of her favorite teachers had once told her. "Don't let anything or anyone hold you back." Those words had stayed with her, a beacon of hope in moments when everything felt overwhelming. Life took an unexpected turn when she found out she was pregnant at just 16. The news had hit her like a freight train. The father, a boy from her high school, had disappeared from her life almost as soon as she told him. "I can't do this," he had said, his voice shaky with fear and immaturity. "I'm not ready." And just like that, she was left to face the journey alone. Her mother had been supportive, but the struggle of making ends meet became even more daunting. Amara took on a part-time job at a local diner, working long hours after school to save money for the baby. She'd spend her breaks flipping through baby name books or calculating how much she'd need for diapers and formula. At night, she'd sit at the kitchen table, hunched over her homework, fighting to keep her eyes open. Despite everything, she refused to give up on her education. But the world wasn't kind to girls like Amara. She'd faced the judgmental stares of strangers and the whispered comments of classmates who saw her pregnancy as a mistake, a burden, or worse, a failure. "I'll prove them wrong," she'd tell herself, holding her head high even when it felt like the weight of the world was pressing down on her. Her determination wasn't just for herself. Every kick she felt from the baby growing inside her was a reminder of why she worked so hard. "This is for you," she'd whisper to her belly at night. "We're going to be okay. I promise." The arrest felt like a betrayal of everything she had fought for. Sitting in that cell, she couldn't help but think of all the nights she'd walked home after work, exhausted but proud of the small victories she achieved each day. She'd been careful, always aware of the invisible line she couldn't cross as a young black girl in a town where people saw her as a statistic instead of a person. And yet, here she was, treated like a criminal for simply existing. As the hours dragged on, Amara's resolve hardened. She thought about her mother, her baby, and the community that had silently endured the same injustices she was now facing. She realized this wasn't just about her arrest. It was about something bigger, something that needed to change. Morning light streamed through the small, barred window of the holding cell, illuminating Amara's tired face. She'd spent the night battling the ache in her wrists from the cuffs and the weight of uncertainty pressing on her chest. Just as she was about to give in to exhaustion, the sharp clatter of footsteps echoed through the corridor. "Johnson," a guard called out. "Your lawyer's here." Amara's brow furrowed. "My lawyer?" she asked, her voice hoarse. The guard didn't respond, merely unlocking the cell door and motioning for her to follow. With trepidation, Amara stepped into the corridor, her thoughts racing. She hadn't contacted a lawyer. She couldn't afford one. In the small meeting room, a tall, confident man with a warm yet determined expression awaited her. His charcoal gray suit was immaculate, and his presence commanded attention. He extended a hand as she entered. "Good morning, Amara. My name is Michael Carter. I'm here to help." Amara hesitated, staring at him in confusion. I can't afford a lawyer," she stammered. Michael's smile was reassuring. "You don't need to worry about that. I'm taking your case pro bono." He gestured for her to sit. "I saw the video of your arrest online. It's gone viral, and after watching it, I knew I had to step in." Amara lowered herself into the chair, still wary but desperate for hope. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." Michael's expression softened, and for a moment his confidence gave way to something deeper. "Because I do know you," he said quietly. "Not personally, but I know what it's like to be judged by the color of your skin. I grew up in a neighborhood not much different from yours, and I've seen too many people, too many kids, face injustice like this." He leaned forward, his voice steady and full of conviction. "This isn't just about you, Amara. It's about a system that needs to be held accountable, and I'm here to make sure that happens." For the first time in hours, Amara felt a glimmer of relief. She nodded slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." Michael spent the next hour going over the details of her arrest, taking meticulous notes and asking pointed questions. His sharp mind was evident in the way he pieced together inconsistencies in the officer's actions and highlighted the potential for racial bias. "We're going to fight this," he assured her, "and we're going to win." As he gathered his notes to leave, Michael paused and looked at her. "One more thing, Amara. Don't let them break you. You're stronger than they think." Amara watched him walk away, a newfound resolve settling in her chest. For the first time since her arrest, she felt the weight begin to lift. She wasn't alone in this fight anymore. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as people filed into their seats, their anticipation palpable. News of Amara's case had spread like wildfire, and the small room was packed with journalists, community activists, and curious locals. Michael Carter stood at the defense table, his expression calm but focused, as he shuffled through his notes. Across the aisle, Officer Trent sat stiffly, his uniform crisp and his jaw clenched. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. "We are here today to address the case of Amara Johnson," the judge began, "versus the state, represented by Officer Trent." The prosecution opened with a dry recitation of the charges. "The defendant was arrested under suspicion of theft and loitering," the prosecutor declared. "Officer Trent's actions were in accordance with standard procedure, given the suspicious behavior exhibited by the defendant." Michael's jaw tightened slightly, but he remained composed. When it was his turn to speak, he rose smoothly, his voice measured but firm. "Your Honor, members of the jury, today we are not just addressing the actions of one officer. We are examining the deep-seated biases that lead to unjust outcomes for people like my client." The first witness called to the stand was Officer Trent. His demeanor was rigid, his responses clipped. I followed protocol, he repeated like a mantra. The call I received described a young woman loitering outside the convenience store. Her behavior was consistent with the report. Michael stepped forward, his questions sharp and precise. Officer Trent, did the report specify the individual's race? Trent hesitated. It mentioned an African-American female. I see. And did you personally witness my client engaging in any suspicious activity? Michael's tone was calm but unrelenting. She appeared, evasive, Trent replied, faltering slightly under Michael's steady gaze. Evasive, Michael repeated, his voice carrying a slight edge. Walking home from work while pregnant is now considered evasive? The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder, but the judge's gavel quickly restored order. Michael continued, presenting CCTV footage that showed Amara walking past the store without stopping. He then introduced character witnesses who testified to her integrity and work ethic. The turning point came when Michael produced a file. Your Honor, I'd like to present evidence of Officer Trent's history of racially biased policing. The courtroom erupted in whispers as Michael detailed prior complaints filed against Trent, each alleging racial profiling. Facing Trent directly, Michael delivered the final blow. Officer Trent, if my client were not black, would you have acted the same way? The courtroom was silent as the bailiff called Amara Johnson to the stand. All eyes turned to her as she stood, her hands trembling slightly but her chin held high. With each step she took toward the witness stand, the weight of the moment bore down on her. This wasn't just her chance to tell her side of the story, it was her chance to be heard, to stand up not just for herself, but for others who had been silenced. After being sworn in, Amara took a deep breath, her fingers gripping the edge of the stand. She glanced at Michael Carter, who gave her a small, reassuring nod. It was enough to give her the courage to begin. My name is Amara Johnson, she started, her voice steady despite the emotions threatening to overwhelm her. I'm 17 years old. I'm a student. I work part-time at a diner, and I'm expecting my first child. Her words hung in the air, and the room seemed to lean in closer, drawn by the calm strength in her voice. The night I was arrested, I was walking home from work. It was late, and I was tired. All I wanted was to get home and rest. But instead, I was stopped, searched, and handcuffed in front of strangers. I was treated like a criminal for no reason other than someone deciding I looked suspicious. Her voice caught, but she pushed forward, her hands now clenched in her lap. I kept telling Officer Trent I hadn't done anything wrong. I begged him to let me go. I told him I was pregnant, but he didn't care. He didn't listen. The room was utterly still, the audience captivated by her raw honesty. Amara paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. What scared me most wasn't the handcuffs or the patrol car. It was the feeling that nothing I said or did mattered, that no matter how hard I tried to prove I was innocent, no one would believe me because of how I look. She swallowed hard, her voice breaking slightly. That was the moment I realized how much my baby might have to face just for being born. Michael glanced at the jury, many of whom were visibly moved, their faces reflecting a mix of empathy and discomfort. He knew Amara's words were cutting through the noise, reaching the heart of the matter. My whole life, Amara continued, I've worked hard. I've stayed out of trouble. My mom taught me to be strong, to hold my head high, even when people looked down on us. But that night I didn't feel strong. I felt powerless. I felt like no matter what I did, I'd already been judged. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. Instead, she straightened her back and looked directly at the jury. I don't want anyone else to feel that way. I want my baby to grow up in a world where they don't have to be afraid of walking home at night, where they can be seen for who they are, not just for what they look like. That's why I'm here. Not just for me, but for everyone who's ever been made to feel small or invisible or less than human. The courtroom was thick with emotion. A few sniffles could be heard from the gallery, and even the judge seemed to take a moment to compose herself. Amara's words had not only painted a vivid picture of her pain, but also illuminated the systemic issues at the heart of the case. Michael stood, his voice quiet but firm. "Thank you, Amara. No further questions." As she stepped down from the stand, the courtroom remained silent, the gravity of her testimony hanging in the air. Amara returned to her seat beside Michael, her hands still trembling, but her heart lighter. She'd said what she needed to say. Now, it was up to the jury to decide if they'd truly heard her. The courtroom was tense, the air thick with anticipation as the judge re-entered and took her seat. The jury had deliberated for hours, leaving everyone, from Amara and Michael to Officer Trent and the spectators, on edge. The packed room fell silent, every eye fixed on the bench as Judge Marquez adjusted her glasses and cleared her throat. "Will the defendant please rise?" Amara stood slowly, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Michael rose beside her, his calm demeanor masking the storm of thoughts running through his mind. Amara's heart pounded in her chest, each beat louder than the last. The judge began. "This case has brought to light not only the specific events of the night in question, but also broader issues that cannot be ignored. The evidence presented shows a lack of probable cause for the arrest and an overreach in the actions taken by Officer Trent." A collective murmur rippled through the room, quickly silenced by the judge's gavel. "As such," Judge Marquez continued, her voice steady, "the charges against Ms. Amara Johnson are hereby dismissed. She is cleared of all wrongdoing." Relief washed over Amara, and her knees threatened to buckle beneath her. Michael placed a steadying hand on her arm, a quiet reassurance in the storm of emotions. But the judge wasn't finished. She turned her attention to the prosecution table, where Officer Trent sat stiffly, his jaw tight. "Officer Trent," the judge began, her tone firm, "your actions on the night in question have been reviewed and found to be influenced by implicit bias. While the court acknowledges the challenges of law enforcement, it cannot condone actions that undermine the principles of justice and equality. As such, you are to be suspended without pay for 6 months. Additionally, you will be required to attend mandatory training on racial bias and de-escalation tactics." The murmurs returned, this time louder, as people in the courtroom reacted to the announcement. Some nodded in approval, while others shook their heads in disappointment. A few voices from the gallery expressed their frustration aloud. "6 months? That's all?" someone muttered. "At least it's something," another replied. Amara sat back down, her emotions a whirlwind. Relief at being cleared mingled with anger at the leniency of Trent's punishment. Michael leaned toward her and whispered, "This is just the beginning." Change takes time. The judge banged her gavel again, restoring order. "This court is adjourned." She rose and exited, leaving behind a room buzzing with heated discussion. As people began to file out, the courtroom became a microcosm of the larger societal debate. Activists and community leaders clustered together, some celebrating the dismissal of charges against Amara, while others criticized the lack of accountability for Officer Trent. "She's free, and that's what matters," one woman said, her voice resolute. "Free? Sure. But Trent gets to go back to work in 6 months, like nothing happened." "That's not justice," a man countered, his tone sharp. Reporters swarmed Michael and Amara as they exited the courtroom. Cameras flashed, and microphones were thrust toward them. Michael raised a hand to quiet the crowd before speaking. "Today's verdict is a step forward," he said, his voice firm but measured. "But let's be clear. It's only a step. Real justice means systemic change, not just individual accountability. We're not done fighting." Amara stood beside him, her voice steady as she added, I'm grateful for the support I've received. But this isn't just about me. It's about making sure no one else has to go through what I did. We have to keep pushing for a world where everyone is treated with fairness and respect." The crowd erupted into applause, the energy in the air electric. But as Amara and Michael made their way through the throng of supporters and reporters, the weight of the journey ahead loomed large. They knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of a larger fight for justice. The weeks following the trial were a whirlwind for Amara. Though the case had ended, its impact rippled through her life and the community. She returned to school, determined to catch up on her studies, and resumed her shifts at the diner. But something had shifted within her. Every time she walked into class or served a customer, she felt the eyes of her peers and neighbors on her. Some were supportive, offering smiles or words of encouragement. Others seemed unsure, as if they didn't know how to reconcile the quiet girl they thought they knew with the young woman who had stood up to injustice. Despite the scrutiny, Amara found strength in her growing sense of purpose. She began attending community meetings and rallies, speaking out about her experience and advocating for reforms in policing. Her voice, once hesitant, grew stronger with each speech. At home, she prepared for the arrival of her baby, transforming a small corner of her bedroom into a nursery. Soft pastel colors brightened the walls, and a used crib she had found at a thrift store stood proudly by the window. Late at night, as she folded tiny clothes and arranged diapers, she often thought about the world her child would grow up in. She promised herself she would do everything in her power to make it better. Michael Carter sat in his office one evening, the glow of his desk lamp casting long shadows on the walls. The case files from Amara's trial were neatly stacked, ready to be archived. Yet he found himself thumbing through them one last time, the images and testimonies still vivid in his mind. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the framed photo on his desk, a picture of himself as a young boy with his father. His father, a community organizer in the 1980s, had faced his own battles against systemic racism. Michael smiled faintly, remembering the lessons his father had taught him about perseverance and justice. The victory in Amara's case felt significant, but Michael knew it was just one step in a much larger journey. The systemic issues that had led to her wrongful arrest weren't going to disappear overnight. "Change takes time," he muttered to himself, echoing the words he had told Amara. He thought about the people who had reached out after the trial, other young women, parents, activists, sharing their stories and asking for his help. It was overwhelming at times, but it was also a reminder of why he had chosen this path. Michael pulled out a notebook and jotted down a few ideas for his next steps. Proposing community policing initiatives, advocating for implicit bias training in local police departments, and working on legislation to increase accountability. As he wrote, his resolve deepened. The fight wasn't over, but he was ready to keep going. Officer Trent sat in his car, parked outside the police station. His suspension had begun a week ago, leaving him with more time on his hands than he knew what to do with. He stared at the building, the familiar sight now tinged with unease. The mandatory bias training he had attended earlier that day had been uncomfortable, to say the least. Hearing stories from people who had experienced profiling, listening to colleagues discuss their own prejudices, it was like holding up a mirror he didn't want to face. But as much as he resisted, Trent couldn't shake the lingering questions. Had he really been doing his job that night, or had he let his biases dictate his actions? He thought about Amara, her trembling hands as he cuffed her, the way she had looked at him with a mixture of fear and defiance. Her words during the trial echoed in his mind. What scared me most wasn't the handcuffs. It was the feeling that nothing I said or did mattered. Trent sighed, running a hand through his hair. He didn't know if he could ever make amends, but he decided to start small. Maybe it was time to really listen, to understand perspectives he had dismissed for too long. He opened his car door and walked toward the community center, where a group was holding a town hall meeting on policing reforms. For the first time, Trent wasn't there to defend himself. He was there to learn. In the final moments, the camera pans to a quiet park where Amara sits on a bench, cradling her newborn baby. The sun sets in the background, casting a warm glow over the scene. She gazes at her child with a soft smile, her eyes filled with determination and hope. Michael watches from a distance, leaning against a tree. He exchanges a nod with Amara before walking away, his phone ringing with another call for help. In the distance, Officer Trent steps out of the community center, his posture less rigid than before, as if the weight on his shoulders has begun to lift. A voiceover from Amara ends the story. Change doesn't happen overnight. It starts with one voice, one step, one decision to do better. And it grows until one day the world becomes a little brighter for everyone. The soft hum of a lullaby played in the background as the screen faded into a peaceful scene of Amara sitting in a rocking chair by her window. Cradling her newborn baby in her arms, she gently rocked back and forth, her face illuminated by the golden glow of the setting sun. The baby's tiny fingers curled around hers, a small but powerful reminder of the life and hope that lay ahead. The scene shifted to Michael Carter's office. Papers were spread across his desk, and the glow of his laptop illuminated his focused expression. A stack of new case files sat beside him, each one a story waiting to be told, a fight waiting to be fought. Michael paused for a moment, glancing at a photo on his desk of his father, a man who had once fought for equality in his own time. A faint smile crossed Michael's lips before he returned to his work, his determination unwavering. Next, the screen transitioned to Officer Trent. He stood outside the community center, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets as he watched a group of children play basketball on the nearby court. He seemed lost in thought, his posture less rigid than before. Slowly, he walked inside the building, where another session on racial bias and de-escalation techniques was about to begin. For the first time, Trent didn't resist the lessons. He was ready to listen. The scenes wove together in a poignant montage. Amara smiling at her baby as she hung a diploma on her bedroom wall. Michael shaking hands with a new client while reporters snapped photos. Trent sitting in a circle of officers and community members, nodding along as someone shared their story of being profiled. Each image painted a picture of growth, resilience, and the slow but steady march toward change. As the screen darkened, Amara's voice filled the silence. Change doesn't happen overnight. It starts with one voice, one step, one decision to do better, and it grows until one day the world becomes a little brighter for everyone. The music swelled, and the words, "Change begins with accountability," appeared on the screen in bold, powerful letters. The camera panned back to the courtroom, now empty except for the judge's bench and the rows of silent chairs. The voiceover asked a final, thought-provoking question. What would you have done if you were in that courtroom? The screen faded to black, leaving the audience with the lingering question and a sense of responsibility. Slowly, the words, "Join the movement," and a link to an advocacy website appeared, encouraging viewers to take action.